So one other kind of thing we do with attributions that's not necessarily a bias, more just like an assumption, is called just world belief, which is the idea that good things happen to good people and bad things happen to bad people. The world is a just place, according to this assumption. So it's how you can attribute causes if someone is in a great situation. It's because, well, they deserved it. They're a bad person, which leads to these negative attitudes about some of these groups that are hurting. So, for instance, if you see a person who's homeless, you might be like, oh, well, they made bad choices. They did a bad thing. They didn't manage money right, or they spent it all on drugs or whatever. Like you've heard all of those different rash reasons. Um, so it leads to these negative attitudes because we assume, well, if they were a good person, they wouldn't be in that situation, which is an incorrect assumption. But it's why we often have negative attitudes about people who are struggling, which is, again, problematic. And unfortunately, it also leads to things like victim blaming. So this has always been an issue, but recently come up in popular culture. So I'm sure you've heard these types of phrases, like if someone is a victim of like sexual assault, it's like, oh, well, she was dressed that way. What was she wearing? Was she drunk? This type of blaming the victim and assuming, well, if something bad happened to this person, it is because they must have been doing something wrong, right? And a more recent example, this is Chanel Miller. I was just reading her autobiography. You may know her better as the woman who was sexually assaulted by Brock Turner, who was a Stanford swimmer about 4 years ago. Maybe this is something, in case you haven't heard, but I'm from California, so Stanford swimmer was a big deal when this first came out. And brilliant memoir, by the way, highly recommend. But she's talked about that after years of agony in court, Brock Turner only spent 3 months in jail because the judge didn't want to ruin his good reputation. He must be a good person. He's a swimmer. He does good things. So that's obviously good things have happened to him. So he must be a good person. And here's a quote from Chanel. She said, instead, she was pummeled with narrowed, pointed questions that dissected her personal life, her love life, past life, family life, inane questions, accumulating trivial details to try and find an excuse for this guy who had me half naked before even bothering to ask for my name. So it's the idea that, well, a bad thing happened to her, so she must have, there's some issue somewhere in her life that we can dig up to justify that action. So think about this next time you see any sort of negative event in the news and how people are trying to place blame. Just world belief is a way that we often place blame, unfortunately. Okay, there are also cultural differences in how we make attributions about people. So we've kind of hinted at throughout this course these two different types of cultures. Collectivist cultures, so cultures like China, groups of people who are all kind of working together under like one common rule, and then individualistic cultures. So this is more like the US, where we kind of have more freedom and independence to make separate decisions. So collectivist cultures then tend to have more emphasis on environment and situation. They're less self-centered. They're more into serving the group, attributing successes to the group, and less on themselves, whereas individualistic is the opposite. So you tend to be like, oh, that happened because that individual is mean, or that I am great, or that type of thing. So you're more likely to use things like the self-serving bias, so attributing successes to yourself and your failures to the environment, and the just world belief, so good things happen to good people, etc. So this is all about me versus we in these two different examples. And again, bringing it back to COVID, because COVID just demonstrates everything in social psych. The cases of COVID. So again, this is from July. So I could have updated this graph, but then also was a little depressed to do that. So you could see cases over time in both of these areas. So in China, because they're more of a collectivist culture, they handle mask wearing better than we do. So they all are able to kind of down regulate, decrease the amount of COVID cases that they have daily. And I don't know what this graph looks like now, disclaimer, but at least in July, it was decreasing. Whereas in the US, where we're more individualistic, if you don't want to wear a mask, you don't wear a mask. Our cases are increasing. So China's already normalized mask wearing to decrease spread of illness, whereas we don't wear masks if it inconveniences us, even if it helps other people. I really like all the memes about COVID. So I think the biggest mistake we made is telling Americans that wearing masks is to protect other people. Know your audience, which is a sad fact, but also just true. So yeah, this COVID's a good example of different cultural influences.